Okay, the documentarian, the filmmaker in me wants to make that the last question because it was such a perfect answer. However, I'm going to botch it
Well,
and
the
ask you,
editor,
and the
the
editor,
editors
and our wonderful editors can fix that.
can cut it out entirely too.
Can your documentaries have won every award there is? I imagine Grammys, Peabodys, Emmys. You're working currently on this opus for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. You had success very young. Is it what you expected?
No, not at all. In fact, I thought that becoming a documentary filmmaker, I had grown up wanting to be a feature filmmaker, a Hollywood director, John Ford or Alfred Hitchcock or Howard Hawks. Those were my heroes growing up. And I think that I wanted to be Alfred Hitchcock. My mom was dying my entire life until she died when I was just short of my 12th birthday. And I remember a few months afterwards, my father was watching Sir Carol Reed's Odd Man Out about the Irish troubles in my teens and 20s. James Mason. And my dad started to cry. Never saw my dad cry. And at that moment, said, I want to be a filmmaker. And then going to college and sort of having my molecules rearranged at Hampshire College with teachers who were social documentary still photographers, that I thought that becoming a documentary filmmaker in American history was like taking an immediate vow of anonymity and poverty. And part of that was reinforced by my desire to move out of New York City to come up here to be able to figure out how to edit my first film. And it got nominated for an Academy Award, and people said, oh, you're going to move back to New York, you're going to LA. And I said, I'm staying here. And so I used to think moving up here was the best decision. It was actually staying here was the best decision, because there's a humility that comes from a small town like this. You cannot, and the weather, you cannot be anything but sort of humble.
So coming up here to New Hampshire gave you, for economic reasons at the time,
Yes,
you were young and poor and struggling,
exactly.
allowed you the freedom to do what you do, but it gave you something else as well, some kind of mental space to focus on the stories?
A kind of splendid isolation takes place. And
But in a way, you're telling stories of people, and perhaps you could argue the counter, which would be, wouldn't staying in Manhattan surrounded by people and stories have been also?
well, you could ask him if you were around Leo Tolstoy, who writes novels filled with hundreds and hundreds of characters, that the requirement in order to summon them, in fiction in this case, not fact, requires a kind of removal. To be able to do it. And so there's paradoxical. I'm close to New York City. I spend a lot of time there. I love the city. I was born in Brooklyn. I didn't grow up there, but it's part of my lifeblood. All of my daughters live there, so it's not an either or. And I think that's the problem. We have become so attached to facile and really non-existent binaries that everything is always argument. And in fact, the essence of a good story is the disarming of argument in favor of accepting the possibility, as Wynton Marsalis said in my jazz film, that sometimes a thing and the opposite of a thing could be true at the same time. Like, we understand that in our personal lives. We understand that in our intimate lives. We understand that in great stories. We just can't drag it into a kind of public sphere these days. It has to be an argument. It has to be either won or lost. Up or down, good or bad, gay or straight, young or male or female, all these things that we do, and they're non-existent. And what you forget is that the best stories are like a wheel in which you are aware of all the spokes, and that you can have, and things can coexist that are contradictory. And that's the essence, that it isn't agenda-based narrative. It's just the whole wild, unformed thing, which you have to figure out how to honor, because nature has never listened to Aristotle, has not read Poetics, and so you have to find a way that both respects the perfection of what takes place in all of human events and what goes on in the universe, and then how we humans tell the story. Honey, how was your day? Does not begin, I back slowly down the driveway, avoiding the garbage can at the curb. We edit human experience, and when it's big stuff of the kinds of themes that we try to tackle, you've got an obligation that you can't do it. Like I could
Right.
be anywhere else but PBS instantly. The Vietnam series, 10 episodes, 18 hours, cost $30 million. I could have walked in as I began that project to any premium cable station or any streaming service and said, I need $30 million, and they would have given it. What they wouldn't have given me are the 10 and a half years that I needed and knew I needed to do it. They'd want it in 2.5 years. And so what public broadcasting has done, what the splendid isolation of Walpole, New Hampshire has done, what the sort of band of brothers and sisters that have worked, some people have worked with me for 50 years or 40 years or 35 years or 25 years, is that we've been able to craft these things without this sort of buffeting that the industry always does, the compromises that always are forced on you. And so I have the great privilege of telling you that every one of the, whatever it is, 39 or 40 films are director's cuts.
It's been documentaries, and I was wondering how you choose your subjects. I know you have projects planned out many years in
Yes.
advance, but why, for example, jazz and baseball and not rock and roll and football?
You know, the glib response, Katty, is to say they choose me. And there's a degree of truth to that. A good story is a good story is a good story, and it will insinuate and insist. So your head might be filled with 40 or 50 topics, as my head is always filled up. But when one drops down to your heart and you realize that it's firing on all cylinders for lots of ways. So I'm in the middle of working on this Civil War series that came out in 1990. And I am realizing that this is the most important event in American history. Everything before it led up to it, everything since has been in many ways a consequence of it. And when that was over, and it was a surprisingly huge, big thing all around the world, we're working on things, and I decided I wanted to do something on baseball. And all of a sudden I realized that I was working on the sequel to the Civil War, and people thought I was nuts. And I said, well, the first real progress in civil rights in a major, not just symbolic, but major social way was when Robinson, the grandson of a slave, made his way to first base on April 15th, 1947, way after the end of the Civil War. But it was the first real progress, the beginning of what we would call the civil rights era, though it had been going on before, and there were other people who had worked hard in all the intervening decades and even been baseball players at the equivalent of the major league level in the 1880s and 90s until they were banned because of the color of their skin. And then you have jazz, which is created by a people who have the peculiar experience of being unfree in a supposedly free land. And they create this music that is recognized around the world as our art form. And then I realized I was working on a trilogy. I had to get baseball done in order to start jazz. So a lot of the times the thinking is different. Another point is just seeing a bit of footage, or somebody says, a friend of mine said, what about country music? And I went, oh, perfect. And I'm a child of rock and roll, but I knew that that was going to be a much better subject than rock and roll or whatever.
So that's because that's where I was wondering, when you're a child of rock and roll, I'm a child of rock and roll, what is it about rock and roll that isn't enough?
It's not that it's not. It's that I don't want to tell you stories about what I know. I want to, that's homework, right? Like what you should know. I'd rather share with you a process of discovery. And so I dive into things that I don't know enough about. I mean, I did do baseball, which I thought I knew something, and every day was a daily humiliation. And I did do Vietnam, which I lived on a college campus, Ann Arbor, Michigan, growing up through grade school and high school. And so I thought I knew it. I had a high draft number, so I was trying to conscientious objector, so I got out of that, but I knew nothing. And so the idea...
Because you hadn't been there.
Because I hadn't been there, because I also hadn't understood the full context of all of those different spokes. I saw it from the...
You saw your spoke.
I saw my spoke. And so what we like to do, I mean, it's the same with the revolution now, the American Revolution, is that it has become so protected and encased in sort of amber because we accept the violence of the Civil War, we accept the violence of all the 20th century wars that we've been in, but the revolution, these are great ideas, and they are. And great men are thinking great ideas, but you forget it's our Civil War. Our Civil War is a sectional war. The revolution's a civil war. There's like at least 20%, maybe 25%, in some areas much more, are loyalists, remaining faithful to the king. There's nothing wrong with the status quo. That's called a conservative. That's what you do. And the patriots were risking everything, and lots of people who are disaffected, just sort of paying attention to who's going to win and just wanting to stay out of harm's way. So it makes places like New Jersey and South Carolina about as bad as South Vietnam during the Tet Offensive.
It's interesting what you say there about the Revolutionary War, and it makes me think of the Holocaust and America's, and you approached it from this unusual angle of America's relationship with the Holocaust. Are you trying consciously to expose questions rather than, I suppose, provide answers that haven't been, that people don't want to broach necessarily or haven't thought of broaching?
I think
Is that too am I being too grandiose?
Yeah, because it implies a sort of intentionality to it. When you see that something's a good story, you want to do it. And that means if you're going to dive deep, you're inevitably going to bring up contradictory and complex stories that go fundamentally to who we are, who we like to think we are, who we're not, even though we think we are, and all of the possible combinations in between. And that's a complicated thing to do, and you want to make sure that in the course of that, there's no scold, there's no particular political thumb that you're placing on the scale, that anybody, any American, any human being who has got maybe an 8th grade education, although some of our films play even well in lower grade schools, would be drawn to, because ignorance is not a crime. Willful ignorance is, stupidity is. We want to just say, we didn't know, this is what we've learned, can we share with you what we've just discovered? And that, hey, let me tell you what I just learned, is so much better way to at least even begin the process. But we don't go saying, and therefore we'll be able to throw this zinger at Americans and really make them wake up and no. So stories are one way of keeping things a little bit alive, but also the best stories also wake us up to the realities of what our future will be. And in my case, I take the past to tell us something about not where we are and where we're going to be. Those are byproducts of the films, but where we've been and how very, very much they were exactly like us. You know, people say history repeats itself. It never has. You're condemned to repeat what you don't remember. Lovely phrase, often attributed to George Santayana and the Holocaust. It's just not true. It's a lovely phrase. You'd wish that would be true. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, we can't prove it precisely, so supposed to is the good cheat word, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And that's a wonderful phrase, because that's exactly it. Ecclesiastes, which may be a better authority, the Old Testament said, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun, which means human nature doesn't change. So every time we work for 10 years on a project of the national parks or Vietnam or the American Revolution, you lift up at the end. At no point during it you're going, aha, isn't that so much like today? You know, you look up and you go, oh my God, it's so much like today. This venality, this virtue, this greed, this generosity, it's repeating itself. We know these people, and we understand the people who are both. Sometimes we sort of say, oh, you're bad and you're good. And what we understand from honesty about ourselves, we've got both of those things in us. And we've done some bad things and we've done some good things. And how do we reconcile all of that? So we don't have to throw anybody out. We don't have to cancel anybody out, nor do we have to present some treacly, superficial version of American history. We can just say, this is call balls and strikes. And you know what? The perspective of the shortstop is really different than the perspective of the right fielder or the catcher. And we want to have all those perspectives, as well as the people sitting on the bench and the manager and the people in the stands. Whatever we do, it's going to be like today, because human beings don't change.
It's all of the spokes.
It's all of the spokes. And, you know, that human beings don't change can be, you know, cripplingly sad. And it can also be something to rejoice about. I mean, and and within those parameters is where human experience lies. The fact that we don't learn and the fact that we do learn.
When you think about America, it seems that there's almost a sort of an America you're longing to describe or searching for, or portraying a kind of de Tocquevillian America of shared experience and community. And I was wondering if that's why you go to history so often, that you find it more in history than you might find it today.
No, I live in a small town. You see it every single day, the kind of willingness to help another, to wave I walk 3 miles every morning with my dog, and I wave at every car, whether they wave back or not. And most people wave back. I think maybe at the beginning, growing up, I had a kind of idealized version of my country. I love my country. I don't know anyone who loves their country more than me. As I learned to tell the stories, I learned how complicated it was. From the very, very beginning, from the first stories that we're telling, that for everything and the opposite thing might also be true. And so it became incumbent to try to figure out how, and I've worked with principally Jeffrey Ward, who has been a master as a writer in tolerating the contradictions between Americans and within Americans. Somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who was able to distill a century of Enlightenment thinking into one remarkable sentence, that I think the most important sentence in the English language after "I love you," that begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." He said sacred and undeniable, and Franklin said no, self-evident. And the last thing in the world that was self-evident were the truths that he was about to articulate. They were not. Everybody was a subject up to that point, and he was suggesting something else. But he said that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator, meaning this is not bestowed by any monarch, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He owned hundreds of human beings in his lifetime, and he knew it was wrong, and he kept doing it. And the historian Annette Gordon-Reed in the film said, well, why, if you knew it was wrong and you could do it? She goes, that's the question for all of us, which was exactly the right answer. The impulse is to go either to shame Jefferson or be upset with anybody who even brought up the fact that Jefferson did that. Why are you muddying the waters? And so what we're saying is that American history is a mirror that holds up to us an incredibly complicated story of us. I've said this, I make films about the US, but I make films about us and all of the intimacy of that lowercase 2-letter plural pronoun, all the intimacy of us and we and our, and all of the majesty, the complexity, the contradiction, and even controversy of the United States. And it's, if I were given 3,000 years to live, and I will not run out of topics in American history.
If you had to choose a modern subject to find that essence of America.
Yeah. So
would you be interested in doing so, and where would you look?
Oh yeah, well it's less modern. I need to have, history provides a kind of triangulation. Philip Graham, who owned the Washington Post, wrote that journalism is the first rough draft of history. It's a wonderful phrase, until you stop and think, have you ever turned in a rough draft? Yeah. No, it requires what? A little time, a little work, and stuff like that. So what history is allowing some passage of time to provide perspective and to get even more sources, right? So we have great journalists in our country, and that is a wonderful tradition that we have, and the best in the world, I believe. And yet, you need some distance. We're I've been interviewing Obama about his administration, and the longer I wait to do that film, the better it will be, because of the passage of the perspective that the passage of time will give. And the other day, even though all these projects and more, Martin Luther King, things like that, Crime and Punishment, will go to the 2030s, I just the other day said, boy, I'd like to do a history of the CIA. But somebody asked of Duke Ellington, who is certainly our most prolific, maybe 2,300, 2,400 compositions, and I think our greatest composer, what the most important one is. He said, the one I'm working on now. And to me, that's how we feel. It's like the process. When I put my head on the pillow, I just want to know that I made a film better that day.
Is there any downside to the success you've had and the fame that's come with it?
Not
for you personally?
Not really. I think first at the isolation here. There's a wonderful nutritional celebrity. Like if somebody stops me on the street in New York, it's because they've spent 15 hours watching, you know, the Roosevelts. So can I give them 15 seconds or 50 seconds? Of course. And I have unbelievable encounters with people. I was taking my oldest daughter to a college interview at NYU before she went to Yale. And we were walking across Washington Square Park, and this man came up to me, and he moved towards me so much so that I started to step in front of Sarah. And he goes, "My brother's daughter died. My brother's daughter died." And I went, "Oh my God." And I put her behind me. And he then said, he saw, and he went, I'm sorry, crib death." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have daughters too." And then he said, "I didn't know what to do. My brother and I were so close. And then I remembered your baseball film, which we'd watched together. So I went back to my parents' house and we got the gloves that we had as kids. And I went to the back door, not the front door. And I walked in and I just handed him the mitt and we went out and we played catch." You know, Katty, that's the only reason why you want to make a film, right? Is that somewhere somebody has some moment in which the emotional archaeology that I've described it had an effect, had a power. So there's not a downside to it. Sometimes I can go for weeks in New York completely anonymous, and I walk everywhere. I take the subway. I am not, you know, chauffeured or Ubered or whatever. And then some week, for some reason, all of a sudden, the fire guy will go, "Hey, that's the guy who made the Civil War or baseball." And he goes, "What?" He goes, "What? You don't know the PBS guy?" You know, like that. And you go, "Okay, this is good." Or you're in a cab, and the Haitian driver said that I couldn't get my citizenship until I passed the test. And what they recommend is that I watch your films. And so I have. You know, and he wants to discuss some intricacy of the Civil War or of the Roosevelts. And you just kind of go, I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. My daughters, when they see that, they understand that, you know, they can see the awards and they can see this, but when there's those individual kind of moments of people telling you, and I've got 150 of those stories, the mail that I got after the Civil War and the little gifts that were given to me. It's just so amazing.
Ken, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now you made me cry.
I made myself cry.
Well, you don't have mascara on.